"26 square kilometers. That is the entire population and land area of a sovereign nation, smaller than a single mid-sized international airport. Its highest point sits just 4.6 meters above sea level, about the height of a two-story house. No mountains, no highlands, nowhere to retreat if the water rises even 1 more meter. This is Tuvalu, the country climate scientists predict could be the first on Earth to vanish completely from the map because of rising seas. What made a people start planning to relocate an entire nation? And what does daily life look like when every large wave here can feel like a warning? To understand why Tuvalu is so fragile, you first have to understand how it was born. Millions of years ago, this was a cluster of volcanic peaks rising out of the Pacific. But volcanoes don't last forever. They cool and slowly sink under their own weight. As the mountains sank, the coral reef surrounding it kept climbing toward the sunlight, a quiet race that lasted thousands of years. The result of that race is a thin ring of coral wrapped around a turquoise lagoon, what geologists call an atoll. Tuvalu is made up of 9 such formations scattered across more than 750,000 square kilometers of open ocean. And here is the country's first contradiction, not because its territory is small, but because its waters are so vast that the sea claims nearly 30,000 times more area than the land does. A nation that holds an enormous ocean yet barely has anywhere to stand. No river runs through Tuvalu. No stream, no natural freshwater lake exists on any of these islands. People survive on rainwater collected from their rooftops and on a thin layer of fresh water floating just beneath the coral sand called a freshwater lens, a layer that turns permanently salty the moment the sea pushes in. In some places, the island is so narrow that standing in the middle of the road, you can see the ocean on both sides at once. Nature didn't build a fortress here. It built a thin blade over open water, beautiful and trembling with every incoming wave. Long before any European map carried the name, Tuvalu Polynesian voyagers had already found it. They arrived in double-hulled outrigger canoes, crossing thousands of kilometers of open ocean with no compass, guided only by the stars, the pattern of the swells, and the flight paths of seabirds. No one knows exactly where the first settlers came from, but anthropologists believe this wave of migration traced back to Samoa and Tonga, moving atoll by atoll over the centuries. The first European to lay eyes on these islands was the Spanish explorer Álvaro de Mendaña in 1568, while searching for gold and the legendary Solomon Islands. He happened to pass the island of Nui. But it would take nearly 300 more years before the outside world truly noticed this place, when whaling ships, then missionaries, And then the infamous blackbirding traders arrived, kidnapping hundreds of islanders to work on plantations in Peru and Fiji. Some islands lost half their population in just a few short years. It wasn't war that nearly erased a people here. It was ships flying the flags of distant empires, arriving before the world even knew their name. The British later named the islands the Ellis Islands after a British merchant who never once set foot here, Edward Ellis. In 1892, the islands became a British protectorate, later merged with the neighboring Gilbert Islands, today's Kiribati, into a single colony, even though the two peoples were entirely different. One, Polynesian, one, Micronesian, with separate languages and separate cultures. That forced administrative marriage lasted 8 decades until 1974, when the Ellis Islanders held a rare, peaceful referendum to separate from the Gilbertese. There was no violence, no civil war, just a vote and a courteous parting between two peoples who had been forced to share a flag that belonged to neither of them. In 1978, Tuvalu gained full independence, and its new name carried a deeply symbolic meaning, 8 standing together, even though the country actually has 9 islands, the 9th having been added only later. A name about unity chosen by a people who had just emerged from centuries of being divided by outsiders who never understood their waters. Tuvalu's turning point did not arrive in a single fateful day. There was no earthquake, no single tsunami you could point to and say, it happened here. Their turning point has been a slow, quiet process, and that is exactly what makes it more frightening than any sudden disaster. For decades, scientists had recorded that sea levels around the Pacific were rising faster than the global average, and king tides, unusually high tides tied to the lunar cycle, were flooding the airport runway, front yards, even cemeteries with growing frequency. But it wasn't until 2021 that the world truly stopped and paid attention when Tuvalu's Foreign Minister Simon Kofi recorded his address to the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow while standing knee-deep in warm seawater on ground that used to be dry land in the capital Funafuti. He stood in a suit behind a podium planted in the middle of the ocean and told world leaders that Tuvalu was sinking, but so was the rest of the world, just a little more slowly. The video spread across the globe within hours, becoming the clearest, most immediate symbol of something that dry scientific reports had never quite managed to convey. Soon after, Tuvalu's government announced an unprecedented plan to build a digital replica of the entire country, every island, every village, every landmark, so that if the physical land one day disappears beneath the sea, Tuvalu could still exist as the world's first digital nation. The question was no longer simply, how do we save the land? It became a question international law had never truly answered before. Can a country still be a country if its territory no longer exists? Not because Tuvalu lacks the will to survive, but precisely because they understand better than anyone that time is not on their side, which is exactly why they are preparing for the worst outcome even while still fighting to prevent it. So when the future of your entire country is being wagered against every centimeter of rising sea, what does everyday life actually look like? Dawn over the Funafuti lagoon arrives fast and quiet. Fishermen are already out on the water before sunrise when the sea is flat as glass and the only sound is the dip of paddles. For many families, the first task of the day isn't breakfast, it's checking the tide, because a sudden king tide can turn the road outside your door into a river within a few hours. Right in the heart of the capital, the country's only international runway stretches across the narrowest part of the island, and in the hours between flights, that same runway becomes the biggest playground in the nation. Children playing football, teenagers playing volleyball, elders sitting and talking on the same tarmac that occasionally welcomes an international jet. Yet, nowhere else on Earth is the airport also the stadium. By midday, tropical heat settles over the island and life slows down around the traditional community meeting houses called maneapa, where women sit weaving mats from pandanus leaves, talking and laughing as dried fronds rustle in their hands. On every rooftop, a simple gutter system channels rainwater down into a storage tank, a resource more precious than almost anything else in the house, since it's nearly the only source of fresh water they can truly count on. As the sun sets, church bells ring out across the island, and families gather for dinner around grilled fish, rice, and pulaka, a giant swamp taro grown in deep pits dug straight into the coral soil. After dinner, young people gather along the lagoon's edge, and no matter how the conversation starts, it often circles back to the same subject: which of their friends is about to leave the island to study or work abroad. A day in Tuvalu is never loud or hurried, but behind that calm, a quiet question always seems to hang in the air: how much longer can this rhythm of life actually continue? Tuvalu's spiritual life is almost entirely bound to the church. More than 90% of the population belongs to the Congregational Christian Church of Tuvalu, and Sundays effectively shut the whole country down. No boats go out, no trading happens, only hymns rising from every village at once. In education, each island has only a handful of small schools, and the brightest students are often sent to Fiji, New Zealand, or Australia for higher education, a door of opportunity, but also the start of a quiet brain drain the country struggles to reverse. In healthcare, the nation has just one major hospital, Princess Margaret Hospital in Funafuti, and any serious case beyond its capacity must be medevacked to Fiji, a journey that can decide someone's life, entirely dependent on an already sparse flight schedule. Economically, Tuvalu relies on three sources of income that few outsiders would ever guess. The first is licensing fees paid by foreign fleets to fish tuna in its enormous waters that, despite the tiny landmass, sit within one of the richest tuna fishing grounds on the planet. The second, and perhaps strangest, is royalty income from its own name, because Tuvalu's national internet domain is TV, and tech companies, broadcasters, and streaming platforms around the world pay to use that domain suffix, turning a few letters of the alphabet into one of the country's most important revenue streams. The third comes from remittances sent home by Tuvaluan men working as seafarers on international merchant ships. Trained at the Tuvalu Maritime Training Institute, for many families, The wages earned on distant oceans matter more than any job available on land. In governance, Tuvalu runs two systems side by side, a modern Western-style parliament, and alongside it, the Falekaupule traditional councils of elders on each island, where community decisions are still made the way they were centuries before the concept of a government ever existed. And when it comes to food, because the soil is too poor for ordinary farming, Tuvaluans dig deep pits down to the water table and fill them with composted leaves to create artificial growing soil, all to sustain one nearly irreplaceable crop, the pulaka. Not because they lack farming skill, but because their land was never really built for growing anything. It was built from coral, not from silt. Today, sea levels around Tuvalu are rising at roughly 1.5 times the global average. Every year, king tides push further inland, and the pulaka pits grow increasingly saline, forcing more families to depend on imported rice and food. Alongside the threat from the sea, Tuvalu faces an equally serious quieter migration. More and more young people are leaving in search of education, work, and a safer future in New Zealand, Australia, or Fiji, leaving the population at risk of aging and shrinking over time. In 2023, Tuvalu and Australia signed a treaty called the Falapili Union, the world's first agreement to formally open a migration pathway specifically for climate reasons, gradually allowing Tuvaluans a route to settle in Australia when needed. It is a precious safety valve, but it also raises a question with no easy answer. When a country starts planning for its own people to leave, is that wise preparation or the first step of a farewell to the land of their ancestors? Not because Tuvaluans want to abandon their homeland, but precisely because they love it enough to find any way possible to keep it alive, even if only as data, as a digital map, as collective memory, long after the thin coral ground beneath their feet is gone. Perhaps that is Tuvalu's greatest paradox. The smallest, most fragile nation on Earth is teaching the rest of the world its biggest lesson about what it truly means to call a place home. That home was never just the ground under your feet, but everything a people is determined to hold on to in whatever form it takes, once the ground itself is no longer there. If Tuvalu's story made you think a little differently about the planet we all share, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next journey where we keep exploring the strangest, most fragile places left on Earth. And leave a comment telling me where you want our next journey to take us.